Welcome back. This is Unit 4, our third lecture in Unit 4 on architecture. So, terms we need at the very start are about the basic construction methods. So we can divide architectural building processes into a couple of different categories. One would be the shell system, in which the building material is not only what supports the walls and roof, but is also the outer skin or structure of the building itself. So a shell system building is definitely making use of what we call load-bearing construction, that the objects that are making up the supports are also holding the weight or bearing the weight of the element as well. In skeleton and skin, on the other hand, we have an internal structure such as girders or studs of wood or metal that create the structure that hold the building upright and support the upper floors and the ceilings and roofs. The outer surface of it could be covered in a variety of different weather-safe materials like glass or siding or even brick. Tensile strength is a term we need to understand as well. Tensile strength is the ability of a material to span a horizontal space without support from underneath. So very important if you're going to try to build windows or doors in a wall. You want to make sure that the upper lintel above the door can support the weight of the building above that so that the building doesn't collapse where that hole of the door is. So shell systems, the best example I can really give you is an igloo. If you think of it almost like a turtle shell, right? The thing that holds the support of the roof is also the outside wall. If you ever built anything with the kids' toy known as Lincoln logs, or you've seen a traditional log cabin, the support is the outer covering. Those are shell system buildings. But far more common is the skeleton and skin system. And really, if you look at a skeleton, especially the rib cage, next to a roof that's being built, you can really see why we call it this. So this could be made of wood, it could be made of metal, but the idea is that the material that's doing the support is going to get covered by the skin. The pretty outside covering is not necessarily what's holding the thing upright. And here's our visual example of tensile strength. You have to be pretty confident that that stone is going to support some weight without needing support underneath. So anything that extends off of a building, an awning or a porch, we definitely want to be thinking about tensile strength there, as well as in the top of openings like doors and windows. We definitely want to be aware of our classical orders. As we start looking at the development of architecture, most early architecture around the world is made primarily of stone and is built in a stacking technique. We see quite a lot of structures built by early cultures that have vertical elements supporting horizontal elements. And as those develop over time, the way that they are constructed in terms of their proportions and even the way they're decorated changes. And so the Greek culture developed these three major styles. They go from very short and squat to a little bit more elegant to very narrow and very elaborate over time. And that's the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. You can tell the orders apart by looking at the columns on the outside of the building, in particular looking at the top of the column, which is known as the capital. So the top of your capital here in the Doric style is a very simple drum. It's just sort of a round-ish shape. The Ionic is the most easily recognizable, I think, because you are probably familiar with these curlicue shapes on the corners of the capital. Those are known as volutes, V-O-L-U-T-E-S. The Corinthian style is meant to look like abstracted or stylized leaves from the acanthus plant, and they actually do kind of curl and have furled edges. So these styles, if you look at the diagram and then look at examples from ruins of ancient Greece, you can really see simple, more elaborate, extraordinarily elaborate, little square, a little more elegant, over the top. It's sort of how Greek architecture, artwork evolves over the course of the Greek era. Just to give you an example, the buildings themselves, you can see here in these diagrams that the columns become more and more and more slender, and the architecture kind of matches up with the statues. If you look at the earliest Doric temples, the statues that are of the same period are rather short and stocky. They look more like football players, perhaps, than this figure that looks maybe a little more like a baseball player, versus these really over-the-top figures that we see late in Greek history that are overly muscled and extraordinarily elaborate, that go with the Corinthian style. The vertical system of two uprights supporting a horizontal is a construction system we know as the post and lintel system. So think like a fence post. The post is the vertical part that supports the span across this horizontal space. So obviously one of the things have to think about is how far apart can those posts be and still support this material above it in the horizontal space. So post and lintel have some limitations in terms of how tall we can build and how far apart we can place the post supports. A way of dealing with that changes things a little bit is the Roman innovation of the rounded arch. Instead of just having a flat straight across, I can replace that lintel with a perfect half circle, and that allows me to raise the height that I can reach considerably between the same two posts. It also allows me to then span a greater distance. If I use a really big half circle, then I can push the supports much further apart, which makes a lot of sense if I'm trying to build, as in this case, a bridge across water. The Romans also invented concrete. They had several different recipes for different purposes, but they would often build their buildings by creating wooden molds, wooden barriers that concrete could be poured in between to create shapes, and then beautifully cut marble could be put on top of that, on the outside of it, to make it more decorative and more beautiful. And in fact, that's how the Pantheon was built. It is very unlike any Greek architecture. The Greeks were accustomed to this triangular top on the front of their temples at the main entrance on the short ends of the rectangle of the temple, known as the portico, the porch, and the triangular area is the pediment. If you walked up to this building when it was new, you would not really be able to see much other than the portico and the pediment, and you would think you'd be walking into a traditional Greek rectangle. And yet when you walk inside the Pantheon, it's a circular space that is as high as it is wide. You could fit a perfect sphere into that space, made possible by the advent of the dome, and that is an offshoot of the round arch. The Romans also took the Greek temple design and changed it a little bit. Instead of having the columns running around the outside, they built more solid walls, brought the columns to the inside into side aisles and a big open space in the center. They also added, instead of flat ends, these rounded ends called apses. And you can see them here. There's the apse there and there. This building style is known as the basilica, and it is actually a civic building, an administrative building, where you might go to see a judge to get a legal document officiated. The structure of the basilica will then influence the way that cathedrals are built by the first Christians. Of course, Christianity is being practiced in Rome. It is for a long time a religion that is not acceptable to the royal family or to the majority of the people of the Roman Empire. It's illegal at various points. It becomes legalized, though, roughly around the year 300. And so when the Christian architects start using or needing to build churches, they really base their idea off of the Roman basilica. And you can kind of see why. This is the cross-section of the basilica. Doesn't it look like a church? Side aisles with this big space in the middle. That's exactly what the Christian architects are going to do. So we go from the temple to the Roman basilica to the Christian cathedral. So you can see that this is very much like the basilica form, except we've done a of changes. In the original Greek temple, the entrances are on the short sides. In the basilica form, the entrances are on the long side, these round ends, two of them. So here we've gone back and made the entrance on the short side. We've taken off one of the rounded ends, just left one here, which allows for the focal point of the altar. And one other element has been added, what we call the transept or transverse or crossing aisle. And that aisle from above makes the church into the shape of a cross, which is a pretty clever design idea. The cathedrals themselves evolved from the Roman architectural technique of the round arch, which we see in the earliest cathedral designs from the Middle Ages. These are known as a Romanesque style because they have round arches. So you want to be able to recognize the round arch from the early period of the Middle Ages, roughly around the year 1000. But by the time we get into the 12s, 13s, we into the style known as the Gothic. And so the Gothic style has a pretty interesting change. With our round arch, we're improving on the post and lintel system. I can go taller. And if I want to span a greater distance, I can use a taller arch and push those support pillars off to the side. If I want to keep building a taller and taller church, though, I would end up with it being impossibly wide. Have the advent, rather than the round arch, we have the advent of the pointed arch. So that's going to allow the building to be super tall, but still relatively. But you know that a building that is structured like this is going to be subject to the likelihood of falling down. It needs more support. So we see the addition of the flying buttress, which carries the weight of the roof downward and carries it out further to the support beams on the outside, which sort of increases the footprint of the building, makes it more stable. So as we move into the Gothic era, you can see we can get much higher height. You can see in this cross-section from the outside our flying buttress being supported by the pier, more flying buttresses, more piers, which extends out that support from the outside. So it's almost as if the building has an exoskeleton. The support is on the outside in these buttresses and flying buttresses and piers, but it also allows me to pierce the walls with more and more glass. So it doesn't have to serve the purpose of supporting the roof, because part of what is carrying the weight of the building is this exterior support. So that allows me to perforate the walls with more and more glass. When we move into the Renaissance, we see a renewed interest in the architectural styles of Greece and Rome, and we see that particularly with the architect and author Palladio. Palladio actually, after his death, his writings were published in what became known as the 4 Books of Architecture, and those books were published and republished for hundreds of years. People who colonized the colonies in what becomes the United States of America, those early colonists quite frequently brought these design books with them and based their architectural designs off of things they found inside these books. So you can see some of the architecture of even our own downtown in Wilmington, but certainly the architecture of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. has its roots in the designs of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and then also, of course, the architects of the Renaissance. As much as this looks like it came from ancient Rome, this is designed by Palladio. And in fact, it's very similar to the basic layout of the earliest plantation homes in the South, which very often had elaborate staircases, an open central hallway dividing the first and second floors into 4 big rooms on the corners on either side of a hall. In the Baroque, architecture became even more expressive, and this design I thought would appeal to you guys in a way. It actually is an addition to St. Peter's Cathedral made during the Baroque by the architect Bernini. This colonnade almost acts like arms that reach out from the building to encircle that plaza, it's almost as if the church is reaching out and bringing you inside of it, which makes sense because, of course, at this period, a lot of are beginning to form and people are moving away from Catholicism. Also in the Baroque, we see this incredible, elaborate approach to architecture, not only in buildings, but in landscape architecture. What you're looking at here is not a floor plan of hallways. That's actually the garden diagram for the backyard of the Palace of Versailles. Here is the palace itself. All of this space at one time was swampland that had to be drained and leveled and then changed into this elaborate architecture of landscape. So there's the building, there's the garden. It's pretty incredible. You can also see the 3 roads that lead you directly to the palace. Well, the genius of Versailles is that the king moved his seat of power out of Paris, the capital of France, a few miles away to Versailles, where he forced court to move with him. So therefore the king had total control over everyone who was influential in the court. They all essentially had to live in his world, in his palace, and the entire day revolved around the wishes of the king. We certainly can see how elaborate decoration was. I mean, this is pretty over the top, right? There are engaged flat columns known as pilasters that are gilded at the top, all this carving, there's sculpture, there's painting all over the ceiling. It is one of the most elaborately decorated buildings that we've seen. Believe it or not, period after the death of Louis XIV, architecture and interior design gets even more elaborate. When we move into the period known as the Rococo, check that out. This room isn't even a rectangle anymore. There are very difficult transitions. It's hard to say exactly where the wall stops and the ceiling starts, because this kind of functions as a wall. This certainly does, but it's also the ceiling. The artwork even is not in a square or rectangle format. It's scalloped edged like a natural object, and if you look really closely you can see little cupids flying around that appear to be pulling back the fabric of the building to expose the painting underneath. So for some people, the Rococo is a perfect example of how much excess there was in decoration and in new architectural forms. You can imagine people might want something simple after this level of detail. We certainly see the reliance in our own culture on the forms and architectural styles of the past. You can see that in the White House and in the Capitol building, which are definitely based off of ideas from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. As we move into the industrial era, we start seeing buildings being constructed more and more with skeleton and skin systems using new technology. So in the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, one of those new technologies is cast iron. Of being able to make the individual pieces ahead of time and then assemble them on site in a technique or process we call prefabrication, making it ahead of time. Fabricating is making, prefabricate, make it ahead of time. This is a design for a building that was built for a custom purpose. The decision was made to have essentially a World's Fair in England, roughly around the year 1850. And the idea was to showcase all of the best art, architecture, design, objects of industry, products that were being made in the Industrial Revolution from all over the world. And there was no building big enough to do it. So a designer was hired, Joseph Paxton, primarily built greenhouses, glass buildings, right? And he designed this enormous building using cast iron and glass. It was built outside of the city center of London. It was built on site. They even built it over existing trees, which they didn't tear down. They left them in place. And built in a matter of months instead of a matter of years. And it's as big, if not bigger, than a cathedral. It is almost 2,000 feet long at its longest point. It's over 400 feet wide at its widest point. It's over 100 feet tall at its tallest point. So this building was actually taken apart and moved and reassembled. The building did eventually catch fire. It was destroyed, but you can imagine that in its heyday, it was like the birth of a brand new world, thanks to machines and to factories and to prefabricated objects. So cast iron is the material that makes up the Eiffel Tower, and putting glass around it, this building has no skin. It's just the skeleton, which at the time that it was built, some people considered extremely ugly. We have a big advance, though, when we move from cast iron to steel. And so even though it may seem short to you, what you're seeing here is one of the first skyscrapers made possible because of the use of steel. Steel is stronger but lighter than cast iron, and it's less likely to crack. So when we have the advent of steel prefabricated beams and the invention of the elevator, we can build taller and taller buildings, and that's exactly what begins to happen in the US. This is one of the earliest skyscrapers by the architect Louis Sullivan, and for the purpose of the test, I definitely want you to know Louis Sullivan's design philosophy, which is form follows function. As we know, form is everything that contributes to how something looks. So form follows comes after function. So the most important part of the design is thinking about how the thing will function. This building needs to function vertically. It's multiple office spaces stacked on top of each other. So the architecture of the building emphasizes vertical lines in the design, which draws your eye upward. You can see that as buildings got taller and taller, the decoration of the building became really kind of funny. This is a design by Cass Gilbert. It is the Woolworth Building in New York City, and it looks kind of like Gothic cathedral, but tall. So you can see that some of the architectural details from earlier styles don't really mesh that well with these enormous tall structures. So you can imagine that architects were beginning to look for different ways of doing things. We can certainly see that here in Chicago. This is a skyscraper from the firm of Howells and Hood. The design was for, or created rather, as a competition. This is a building that houses Chicago's newspaper, the Tribune, and there was a competition held to see if we could discover an architect who could design the world's most beautiful skyscraper. So the design that was selected looks kind of like a Gothic cathedral, but the ones that I think are kind of interesting are the ones that didn't succeed. The second place looks more like what you think a cathedral, or rather a skyscraper, should look like. It looks more like a glass box. So you can see that people were beginning to toy with this idea of how can we make this new form in a new language visually. That brings us then to the Still style, which is very much about simplicity and geometry. The designer Gerrit Rietveld was the architect and the designer of the furniture for this open floor plan building that consists primarily of geometric shapes, straight lines, simple primary colors, red, yellow, blue, plus of course black and white. It could go with any culture. And that's also at the heart of what the Bauhaus is all about. The Bauhaus is an art, architecture, and design school in Germany, and they preached the use of modern materials like concrete, glass, stone, steel. They wanted to show these industrial materials. They did not want their buildings to be covered with weird, excessive decorations, columns and pilasters and carvings and statues. And they emphasized the use of geometry. Now, it looks simple to us and maybe not pretty, but remember that at the time that this was made, it was a brand new idea, and it was a very democratic idea. It was less expensive. It had multiple purposes. It wasn't dependent on the knowledge of a particular culture from the past. It was very much about the contemporary world and the future. So you can imagine that as the Nazi Party grew in power, they were very opposed to this kind of architecture and teaching style that emphasized the idea that people were equal and that people had a right to equal access to knowledge and to living and working spaces that were affordable and were efficient. So the Bauhaus was shut down by the Nazis. You can imagine also that what the Bauhaus was doing was preach the fusion of all of the arts and architecture and crafts all as one. They believed that a perfect building was sort of the apex of what the school was about, but that a perfect building would house workspace and living space that was efficient, easy to use, easy to maintain, inexpensive to afford, and that would have beautiful artwork in it, would have the people in it would wear beautiful clothing, that everything in your life, from the silverware that you were using to eat your food with, to the fabric that covered your bed when you went to sleep at night, would be well designed and designed in a way that could be affordable to the average person. So you can see that the Bauhaus school was not about separating, but about unifying. And you can see that here in their course syllabus or outline for how they organize their classes. It's in a circle, surrounded by the preliminary, which introduces you to everything. And then the classes, as you get closer to the center, to the goal of this perfect building, separate out into specifics. But you notice instead of teaching painting, teach color. So if you're a sculptor, you would still take the color class. If you were a painter, you would take the color class. The idea was that we were breaking down the visual language that we studied in Unit 2 and applying it to a huge variety of different artistic, expressive concepts. From how our system is structured, we separate our courses out by topic, right? Here's your English writing class, 111, 112. Lit class, you take it. Your art appreciation class could go in here in this humanities box. But somehow the writing classes are in a separate category from your literature or reading class. And all of those are separate from this category, your communications class. Somehow those feel like those things have been separated out. We've talked a lot about history today when looking at architecture, but that goes in a different box. Real history goes in social science, not in humanities, right? So you can see how our system kind of breaks separate areas of knowledge apart, and you can see how the Bauhaus system is more about combining those aspects together. These are examples of Bauhaus student projects that look a lot like the materials and projects that students at Cape Fear do in their Drawing 1 class, where we teach perspective, in Design 2-dimensional or Design 3-dimensional. You can see how all of these ideas are still being taught in art schools today. The Bauhaus architectural style or idea really led to the concept of the skyscraper as a glass and steel box, very simple, unornamented. And when the shut down the Bauhaus, a lot of the architects and teachers from the Bauhaus came to America. They brought those ideas with them. So we call this type of architecture international style because it came from Europe and developed here in America. So one of the most famous of the teachers of the Bauhaus, former director of the Bauhaus, and leading architect in the US fleeing the Nazi oppression in Germany is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And Mies' design philosophy, I want you to know, is less is more. He really preached the idea of simplicity as being an essential aspect of beauty and function. The Twin Towers are perfect examples of international style architecture. And of course they have a different meaning for us today emotionally, but you can imagine that some people thought they were not very pretty to look at. But if you look at the words of the architect who designed them, and he said way before 9/11/2001, he talked about the need for this building to represent something, that World Trade means world peace. The World Trade Center is a living symbol of man's dedication to world peace. The World Trade Center should become a representation of man's belief in humanity. Now, for some people, those are very boring, big, rectangular, solid glass and steel boxes, not emotion. But if you think of it as something that is open to everybody, that's not dependent on the architecture or the style or history of a particular race from the past, you can see that in a weird way, the simplicity of the international style does make for open access to a greater group of people. It is very democratic and very humane, which is an odd thing to think about for something so simple. We certainly want to look at the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright is sort of a maverick in architecture. He does his own thing. It's definitely modern architecture, but he believed in the idea of making the building relate to the site on which it was located. So in a place like this, where we have larger flat areas of grasslands, he developed what he called the prairie style, buildings that were low to the ground and emphasized their horizontal quality. You can also see here the level of detail he went to. He designed the light fixtures, the glass, the furniture, everything in these buildings, even down to the bricks themselves, which are obviously shorter than the typical brick you would buy at a Lowe's or home improvement store, and they're much, much longer. You can also see that he's using two different types of mortar between them. That in between the horizontal levels is gray, but where the butt ends of the bricks come together, he uses a reddish mortar, which kind of hides the seams and makes these long horizontal lines. In this piece, he's making a piece of a family home, a private home, in a landscape that's built from the settling of rocks as they're moved by glaciers over eons. So this landscape is stacks of rocks one on top of the other, and he makes the building do exactly that. In fact, my favorite feature of the building is that the original hillside is actually the furniture in the area around the fire. The hearth he considered the heart of the home. And so when you're inside this building, you're actually sitting on the ground that is the natural landscape itself of that site. It's as if the building was just kind of built around that one moment. As we move into the 60s, into the 70s, more and more organic shapes start to find their way into architecture and design in general, and you start to things that look almost like they could take off into space, which seems appropriate for designs like these for airports. And as we move into the timeline that you have lived in, this entire era has a not great name. We call it the postmodern, which just means after the modern era. Well, modernism is kind of hard to define. The modern world, you could say, begins with the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s. So to keep calling things modern when we're here in 2020 seems like we're talking about a time. So really, we've started using a term for the time period that you have lived through. We call it the postmodern. It's not great, it just means after the modern era. But the postmodern styles of architecture and art are pretty exciting. They allow for the combination of a lot of things that you wouldn't think would go together, mixing and matching styles and references from all different cultures, all different time periods. You guys are used to this, I think, in your fashion, in your music, even in your food. We combine things that are kind of unexpected. They become hot and trendy and new, and that's normal. In terms of fashion, how often have you seen people who are wearing what look like kind of 80s inspired clothes mixed with 90s inspired clothes, but with a very 2000s haircut and makeup approach, right? We combine things in different ways. That's what the postmodern era is about. So this is the new entrance to the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it is completely different from the architecture of the original building. It's a huge glass pyramid, so it looks like it came from the future and from the ancient Egyptian past. It definitely doesn't go with the building as it was originally designed. It's a really kind of daring, strange design choice. Here's what it looks like inside. go into it, down an escalator, buy your ticket, and you pass by the inverted part of the dome, it almost touches this little tiny stone dome underneath. So it's almost like a huge cube of glass. The design idea of postmodernism is often to include elements that aren't entirely functional purely for the way they look. Notice that this is open, so it doesn't function as an awning over this section of the building. You can see here that this building, which is in Portland, changes the outside, the skin, from brick to concrete along a diagonal line to create a pattern and a texture that's completely decorative. It's not about function, it's about appearance. One of my favorite postmodern designs by the same architect we just saw, Michael Graves, is this design for an office building for the Disney company that seems to have columns that are carved into statues of the seven dwarves. That's a reference back all the way to ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. Both cultures made buildings with columns carved to be statues. That's pretty clever. So the postmodern style can look like kind of a crash, or in this case, like a spaceship that's crashed on top of a building. Or it could look like something that's been dropped and broken. Or it could be something like this bizarre textural pattern that we have here. Or something that appears to be unfinished. This is a design by Frank Gehry. It's his private home. He bought a house, remodeled it. This is not the home under construction. That's the final version. It's a mixture of a variety of different styles, textures, and materials that are very different from its original source. He's best known for this type of architecture with curved walls, both inside and out. This is his design for the Guggenheim Museum in Spain, which has no real 90-degree corners in it anywhere. It really looks like it came almost from another planet. You certainly can see the similarity between that design and his design here for a concert hall in Los Angeles. You can see you'll never mix up international style, these with postmodern style, right? They're extraordinarily different.